Hello, I am Dr. Corey Miller with Ratiochristi Campus Apologetics Alliance. I am the president of the organization, and this is Thoughtful Christianity. Joe Dallas is our guest on this episode. He is an author, a conference speaker, and an ordained pastoral counselor. He directs a biblical counseling ministry for those dealing with sexual and relational problems and with their families as well, which is vitally important. He's got a master's degree in Christian counseling and is a member of the American Association of Christian Counselors. He's authored at least six books on human sexuality from the Christian perspective, including Desires in Conflict, When Homosexuality Hits Home with Family, and Speaking of Homosexuality. He has a daily blog to check out as well, Joe Dallas Online. Joe, welcome to Thoughtful Christianity. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Corey, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Definitely. I mentioned briefly to you pre-episode here about my first exposure to you. You know, probably 20 years ago, I ended up in a public debate with a philosopher on the issue of homosexuality at a university in Utah. And I first came across your information on gay theology, and I never even knew that was a thing. So
Yeah, could have thought.
Yeah. So I appreciate your background and your commitment to Christ and trying to get the word out about the good life in Christ and what that entails. So yeah, we're just coming off of Pride Month yet again, and you've written extensively against homosexuality and not showing support of the pride in that kind of sexuality. Yet you lived as an insider deep in the labyrinth of that lifestyle. Share with us your story from the earliest experiences that got you into that world.
Yeah, Corey, I like a lot of people, I discovered fairly early in life that I was attracted to the same sex. I firmly believe most people never choose to be attracted to the same sex. That's not to say I believe people are born that way. I just think, especially in males, it tends to show up pretty early in life, and it is involuntary. I happen to think it's just evidence of the sin nature showing itself in a way that it does not show in most people, but is experienced by a certain percent of the human population. And when I discovered that, I had to make a decision, as all people do. People may not decide to be gay. In fact, I don't believe they do, but they certainly decide what they're going to do about what they feel. And I made a decision to embrace it. And then when I heard the gospel as a teenager, that confronted my beliefs about being gay. Now, when I was a teenager, 1971, I was 16, so I'm 67 now. Why it was not as openly talked about as it is today. In fact, it could get you killed in 1971 to say, hey, I'm a gay guy. But I had decided to make that a part of my identity. I had already begun having relationships with many different men. Unfortunately, I had also been sexually abused as a boy. So while I don't think that alone made me attracted to men, I certainly think that played into a lot of my sexual confusion later in life. So with all of that combined, I was pretty much settled at the ripe age of 16. I'm a gay man, that's it. And the gay rights movement was just starting to take off. And I thought, as soon as I'm 18, graduate high school, I'm going to wave that banner, man. I'm going to be one of them. And then I visited a little church called Calvary Chapel in Costa Mesa, California, pastored by a guy named Chuck Smith. And that was right when what we now call the Jesus movement was just taken off. And I, after about a month or so of deep conviction, realized God did not make me for this. God created me for something more. And even more than the gay issue, I'm a sinner in need of salvation, and I will not be able to save myself. That's when I was born again. But I thought, and this is what I think is especially relevant maybe to many of our listeners, I thought that if I was born again, that alone would make all my gay feelings go away. And although I lived an obedient life, I mean, I stopped all homosexual activity, drinking, drugs, smoking, swearing, everything. I was living a very sanctified life in church at least 5 nights a week, studying the word. Couldn't get enough of that, in deep fellowship. But the temptations were still there. And I didn't dare tell anyone, at least I didn't think I could dare tell anyone, because I thought if anybody in this church knew that I had those feelings, they'd either think I'm a child molester or a freak, or that I'd never really been saved. Now, that was only half wrong on my part. I'd have to say at that time, and Corey, even to a point to this day, if people have homosexual temptations, those temptations are often viewed by other Christians as being very different than other sexual temptations. So a man may admit, yeah, I lust sometimes. Sometimes I do slip and use pornography. Sometimes I'm looking at a woman in ways I shouldn't, et cetera, et cetera. And that's like, well, bro, you got to take care of the sin of the flesh. But if a man admits, I'm attracted to men, and sometimes I have to work on my lust for men, it's like, whoa, that's weird. So I understand it's unnatural. I don't believe we should be comfortable with what's unnatural. But by the same token, it leads a lot of believers to do what I did. I thought, well, keep it hidden. Don't ever confess it. And I think you know the way that plays out. You got a secret sinful tendency you never bring to light. You eventually start giving yourself permission to entertain it, and eventually you embrace it. And in 1978, that's what I did. I just said, to heck with the church, to heck with God. I am tired of saying no to this. I'm disillusioned because, if you stick around any church long enough, you'll be disillusioned with somebody.
Right.
Something's
That's
going
right.
to happen that's going to disappoint you. So I thought that's a very good excuse to say to Christianity, I'm gay. I'm coming out. And I did. I came out with a bang. But after about a year of being just, real promiscuous and doing a lot of heavy drinking and living what you'd call the stereotypical gay lifestyle, the bar scene, the disco scene, I got tired because I missed the fellowship I had had as a Christian, but I wasn't ready to submit my sexuality to God. And then somebody came along and told me, I know a church where you don't have to decide between the two. You can be gay and Christian. Now, in 1978, the church was called the Metropolitan Community Church. And at that time, Corey, that was about the only game in town if you wanted to find what we now call a gay affirming church. A gay affirming church preaches what you just alluded to, pro-gay theology. And that's a pro-gay interpretation of the Bible. I found that church, and I learned that they believed the Bible is the Word of God, but we have misinterpreted it or misunderstood it when it comes to homosexuality. So you can be a born-again Christian and live a responsible gay life, not promiscuous, but with one partner, do it in a godly way, and God has no problem with that. The only homosexuality they said condemned in the Bible was either high promiscuity or very exploitive. But if it was done in a responsible way, that was perfectly okay. Now, I think a lot of people watching this are rolling their eyes and like, oh yeah, right. I know, but think about this.
Can I pause that one second here too?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen this, but for our viewers or listeners, you can hear it. This is called the Queen James Bible, edition 2012. And as I was looking through it today, even in the table of contents, they don't even have the book of Jonah or Micah. So their effort was to go in with those, 6 or so passages and make accommodation. And then we have, a Yale theologian whose book I just read called Queer Theology Beyond Apologetics. So yeah, this is a thing. And you were not just a practicing homosexual. You became a homosexual pastor and defender of this viewpoint, right?
Very committed defender of it. Look, if you're desperate to believe something, you're going to be very susceptible to believing it. Any common sense reading of the Bible would tell you the Bible does not condone homosexuality. I mean, even if you weren't a Christian, if you just read the book, you'd go, well, those guys who wrote that book did not like homosexuality. That'd be the only logical way of reading it with any integrity. But if you want the Bible to say something, Corey, you can choke it hard enough until it says it. I mean,
that's a good point.
Shoot, when I was a kid, the cultist Charles Manson had a whole new interpretation of the book of Revelation, and based on that, he had, 9 people murdered. I mean, that's how extreme that can go. If you want to twist the word, you can make it say whatever you want. It's almost like, not to get off on a rabbit trail, but it's what people do with the Constitution today. I mean, our country, I think, is divided between people who look at the Constitution as a document, which means what it says. That's what it says. That's what it means. And other people who say, well, it needs to be flexible. It needs to breathe. It needs to shift with the times. Those dumb old white guys didn't know a lot of what they were talking about. That's what a lot of people do with the Bible today, that you either read it for what it is, exegesis, draw the meaning from the document, or you practice eisegesis, impose a meaning on the document. That's what pro-gay theology is. I imposed a meaning on the document, not because I read the document and came to that conclusion, but because I came to that conclusion and imposed that conclusion on the document. Now, I must say that was in 1978. I was with the gay church till about 1983. At that time, pro-gay theology was pretty conservative, basically. Now, like some of the stuff you just held up, I know, gets a little more radical.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm glad, because that shows its true colors. It's like, okay, that's how weird it is. But to make it acceptable to believers at first, it came in wearing a suit and tie. It looked very respectable. It relied on original Greek meaning, original Hebrew, and on scholarship, and it all looked very conservative. And it played on the fact that most people don't look up original Greek and Hebrew. And so if some professor comes along and says, well, Paul didn't really say homosexual, he said prostitute, a lot of people go, oh, what do you know? Instead of checking it out themselves. So that's how I think I wound up on staff with the pro-gay church. I had the problem. I was a Christian. I had decided to give in to the problem. Now I wanted a way to legitimize the problem biblically. Pro-gay theology gave me that way. I cannot say I ever fully believed it, but I fully wanted to believe it. And so I adopted it, and I made it my cause for about 5 years.
Wow. Well, there's a lot to be said on this. I mean, your early works were very helpful. Your later works have been helpful still. But for listeners, they can check out your website. We'll mention that again at the end. But just mentioning the theology, I want to talk a little bit about the theology, and then some of the science, and then the politics. So, many Christians make a distinction between homosexual desires and homosexual behavior. But you seem to see problems not only with the latter, the behavior, but also with the former, the desires, the psychology. And I'm thinking here about your book title, Desires in Conflict,
right.
And a subtitle you gave a book, you edited, A Biblical and Compassionate Response to Same-Sex Attraction. So talk to us about same-sex desires or attraction or orientation or preferences. Is it consistent to say that I didn't exactly choose all my sexual desires, and not all my sexual desires are healthy, good, and appropriate?
And that's absolutely consistent. Corey, come on. You and I didn't choose to be born in sin, did we?
Right.
We're not going to say that alone means our desires are okay. Our sin nature, if you look at it that way, is involuntary. We did not ask for it. When I was in the womb, I didn't say, I select a sin nature as opposed to a righteous nature. I had no choice. I was born in sin. I was born with a sin nature. I also chose, as we all have, to give in to that sin nature. So there was the sin of transgression, and there was also the sin nature itself. Now, with homosexuality, I view it as being similar. People do not choose to be homosexual, and yet homosexuality is a product of the sin nature and is thereby a sinful tendency. It almost becomes secondary, this question of did somebody choose it or did they not? Because what matters is not so much what made you feel a certain way, but rather what you do about it. Now, if you entertain a sinful tendency, you have sinned. Just like you were saying, Corey, let's look at heterosexual sin, the desire for any form of sex outside of marriage. Why, a man, on the one hand, did not ask to be susceptible to lusting. I agree. if a man does not commit adultery or fornication or even use pornography, but in his mind he lusts after a woman he's not married to, he has committed an internal form of adultery. So it is a sin to entertain sinful thoughts or desires, even if you do not physically express those desires. That is a transgression, and it is, of course, a transgression to express them. Here's where it gets tricky. A lot of people in the church are susceptible to temptations that are homosexual in nature because their orientation is such that they are susceptible to those desires. It is a sin if they entertain those desires. The fact that they are susceptible is a product of sin nature, but that is not a sin they are committing. Just like a man who's heterosexual, he may be very susceptible to visuals. He sees a pretty girl and, oh, he really, that he's not sinning by having that susceptibility. But as soon as he entertains it, even in a thought, yeah, he's sinned. And that's how I feel about homosexuality. I definitely see a difference between having the desire and committing the act. Of course I do. And Corey, just to muddy up the water a little, there are even men and women who engage in homosexual behavior who do not have that susceptibility. And it is just as sinful if they do. If you've got guys in prison who use each other as an outlet, they may not be turned on to guys, but that act is every bit as abominable as it would be between two gay men who are openly homosexual. The act is wrong regardless of the context of the act. So that would be my take on the difference between the action and the internal desire, or what some people call the orientation.
That's good. And there are, numerous desires or preferences that we have that we don't choose, right? Like, I don't just get up one day and say, today, my favorite color is going to be red. No, right. I'm just given to that aesthetic pleasure. I like chocolate more than strawberry. And some of these things are innocent. Of course, if I don't practice chocolate loving in moderation, that can create problems. But some of them are bad. Adultery, as you had mentioned, there's no moderation in that. I can't just say, well, half adultery, not half. No, I can't just sit on the fence with that. People have desires for animals. People have desires for intercourse with the dead. In fact, people point to certain species like crows that have sex with their dead and say, see, it's right there in nature. But those desires, I see this as desires are to what is desirable, like belief is the truth. We don't always choose our beliefs. I can't just form a belief. If someone says, I'll give you $1 million to say you believe there's an elephant that just walked in the building. Well, I can lie to you, but I can't really come to believe that. What I want to do, though, is I want my beliefs to correspond with what is real for the sake of truth, and I want my desires to align with what is desirable for the sake of goodness. And that's there is an objective goodness and health, isn't there?
Yes, and I think if we are taking our sanctification seriously, we will spend our earthly lives continuing to prayerfully manage our desires and seek that they be brought more and more in line with truth. Amen. I will be the first to admit, if you are inclined to desires that are wrong, you cannot just decide that those desires will go away. What you embark on is a lifelong commitment to say, I will daily take up my cross. The desires I have that would take me outside of God's will, I will submit them to God's will. I will not yield to them. I will resist them as I must. I must crucify, mortify the deeds of the flesh, mortify the flesh, say no to it. And by God's grace, the longer I do that, it really is true that the power of those desires is diminished. Like Paul told the Romans, sin will not have dominion over you. Now, that doesn't mean sin won't be there. I do think there's a difference between the presence of sin and the power of sin. The presence of a sinful tendency, I believe until I die or Christ comes, I will have sinful tendencies. Now, they may change over time. Their power may change over time. But every time I have one wayward thought, or I think, oh, what a jerk, or I feel like being lazy, or who knows what, that's a sinful tendency. But I also feel that the more we are committed to walking in truth, the less pull those tendencies that they have
Right.
on our lives. And you brought up a real important point. There are desires, I would call them sinful desires, that are universal. We can all relate to them. Like what I just said, Corey, everybody can relate to the desire to think, what a jerk.
Yeah.
Of course, not everybody can relate to the desire for sex with an animal. Most of us cannot relate to that.
Yeah.
Most of our viewers will not be able to relate to my background.
Mm-hmm.
Most people will have never had a homosexual desire in their lives. We read the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Leviticus, and we see some sins in there and we go, wow, you're kidding me. Somebody would want to do that? Yes, somebody would. They are the minority. So there are sinful tendencies that are experienced only by the minority, and then there are those that are experienced by the majority. But they're all from the same root.
That's right.
The same nature. It's just in some cases it veers off into a different direction.
Yeah, that's
You see
right.
what I mean? So some are what we would call natural, some are what we would call unnatural.
Yeah, that's a good distinction there too. Let me just discuss with you the science for a minute. There was a couple of years ago, I was in a philosophy class teaching at Indiana University, and I had a former pastor who turned gay and sent me down to the principal's office essentially to get me fired.
I can just see
and
this.
Yeah, I mean, I was using atheistic texts, and but once I got into the human sexuality issue and I gave both sides an education rather than an indoctrination, he called me a homophobe and so forth. So, we have one of the arguments that I gave is from biomedical science, and we've mapped the human genome since 2004, yet there is still no gay gene. While there has not ever been discovered one can accept the possibility, right, that inborn genetic elements may contribute to homosexuality without legitimizing homosexuality itself.
It's the Loch Ness Monster, Corey. We're forever looking for it. Somebody has a picture of it somewhere. It's a little foggy, but maybe that's a monster. Look at that.
Mm-hmm.
We keep tracing it and tracing. We're never going to find the Loch Ness Monster, and we're never going to find a gay gene. But I will be the first. From the beginning of this whole debate, back in 1992, 91 actually is when I think it started in earnest, the born gay debate. I've said from the beginning, we are a fallen race. It is entirely possible that different specific tendencies are inborn. It is entirely possible there's a genetic predisposition to alcoholism and violence and chemical dependency and depression. It's entirely possible. Theologically, I think it's interesting that when Jacob and Esau were born, Jacob was pulling on Esau's heel even then, which is very interesting to me because that shows a usurping kind of an attitude from the beginning, you see. So it's entirely possible. I don't think that homosexuality is inborn. I don't think it will ever be proven to be inborn, but I know that if it was proven, it wouldn't change any of my positions. It would only tell me what we already know. So we're born in sin. So,
right.
I mean, it is not a question of what caused our feelings. The question is, are the feelings in and of themselves worthy to yield to? That is the question. And so to me, it really becomes academic and secondary whether or not we were born gay. And I think one of the biggest mistakes, I know it was popular for propaganda purposes, but one of the biggest mistakes they made gay apologists made was in thinking that if you could prove something is inborn, you've settled the debate.
Right.
No, you haven't. No, you haven't, because it may be, like I said, that violent tendencies, depression, alcoholism, chemical dependency have inborn components. So what? That doesn't legitimize it.
Right. Yeah. Lisa Diamond at the University of Utah, lesbian and major APA researcher, says that she says the male homosexuals have got to stop using the born that way argument because it's going to bite us in the because we all now know that the science isn't there. And frankly, we don't even need it anymore. And sometimes I've brought it up in the context to say, look, our theology as Christians could embrace it in the way that you're saying as part of the sinful nature and the fall. But, running to the camp that I don't believe in God, I'm an atheist. Well, fine. You're not going to find very much help there in Darwinism either, because There's no survival of the fittest. You can't reproduce. And furthermore, because of the nature of the physiology and the anatomy, the anal sphincter, and this is not an anti-homosexual argument. It's against even Christian monogamous couples who might be engaging in male to female sex through rectal intercourse. It's not the same as vaginal sex, which produces life. Rectal sex produces death because the sphincter gets obliterated. The internal elements just opens itself up to cuts and fissures and all kinds of STIs and bad bacteria, doesn't it? And that accounts for a not so flourishing life, to go follow those directives.
You know, if you follow that line of thinking even more, Corey, when I was a gay activist, we used to always say the high rates of promiscuity among gay males, the high rates of STDs, the high rate of alcoholism and drug use and suicidality and depression and partner abuse, all of those are because gays exist in such a homophobic culture.
Yeah.
And I must say, in 1978, at least we had a little bit of fact on our side. The culture was largely, if not homophobic, it certainly disapproved of homosexuality. But in 2022, now those stats all should have changed by now.
Right.
Come on. And yet what you find is in the areas, and I'm talking about major metropolitan areas where you get a parade for coming out as gay, that's where the rates of suicidality and alcoholism and drug addiction and depression and destructive lifestyles are the highest. Now, how can that be so if all gays needed was for everybody to say, we embrace it, you're fine, we're tolerant, no problem, live your lives? Our argument all along was if you'd let us do that, we'd all be healthy people and we wouldn't live such destructive lifestyles. Baloney. That's not how it played out at all. And so I think what we're going to have to start asking ourselves is, are we really trying to pressure people to go against their own intuition, against their own instincts? Because this is the dirty secret people don't like to say out loud, but I think at some level, most of us know it's true. We have an intuitive, instinctive reaction to homosexuality. A lot of people will call that homophobia. I don't. I call it a normal response to something which is abnormal. Something in us says, wait a minute, you're trying to fit together something that doesn't fit together. And I'm saying this now, suppose I was an atheist and I was talking, I'd say, anatomically, that doesn't jive. From what I know of men and women, that doesn't jive. Two guys trying to form a partnership, I don't think it's going to happen. Not just because of the anatomical problem, but because psychologically, the complementarianism simply isn't there. Something's wrong. That's not going to work. Now, we currently feel the same way about transgender. There are some very liberal voices that are saying, wait a minute, guys, if you're a man and you chop your body up, that doesn't make you a woman. And they are being crucified for that. We are forcing people to basically counterintuitively say, okay, yeah, I agree. If you say you're a woman, I may be looking at a guy with a beard and big muscles, but if you say your name is Nancy, I guess your name is Nancy. We're forcing that on people. And really, it's reminiscent to Orwell's 1984 novel when Winston is being tortured by O'Brien, and O'Brien is saying, how many fingers am I holding up? And Winston says 5, and O'Brien says, torture him more until he says 4. And Winston's saying, I don't know what to do. I'm looking at 5 fingers. What can I do but say it's 5? And O'Brien says, we will keep torturing you until you say it's 4. And there's a very important line that he says at that point. It takes a long time to become sane. What he's basically saying is it takes time for you to get so fully indoctrinated according to our definition of sanity. If I tell you that this is 4 fingers, you will believe it. And I will torture you until you do. It's that mentality we've got going where we say, if you misgender somebody, there goes your career. And in some cases, like in Canada, there goes your parenthood, because children are being removed from homes just because the father will not say, my daughter is a son. I mean, this is happening, Corey.
Yeah.
This is no small thing, this demand that people go against their very instincts, never mind a Christian ideology that we are promoting, people are saying no to that. People are actually, with force of government at times, forcing people to go not only against their doctrinal beliefs, but against their very intuition. This
Yeah.
is where this has become, I got to tell you, as a former gay activist, I
Hmm.
was wrong. I was deceived. I was in sin. But I got to tell you, Guy, I don't even recognize this movement we see today. That's not what we were about.
And I
We
think
were about tolerance back then.
And I think that's because the notion of tolerance has changed. When I had that student in my class who now has gone to a PhD in psychology, I asked him, I said, I thought we worked this out. We had a conversation. You're trying to get me fired. And he said, and I said, what about tolerance? And he said, he smiled and said, I don't believe in being tolerant to the intolerant. And I recognize that now as someone who has been published in Marxist thought and what's happening in our culture today. It's heightened well past the 60s, from critical race theory to old racial reconciliation considerations, a repudiation of Martin Luther King and his teachings and so forth, but also in terms of the sexual revolution, which people like Marcuse and other neo-Marxists were behind, but it never took root then. So this critical queer theory that tries to queer Christianity and queer theology today, it takes on a Marxist flavor, a politicization really of all of those issues that we dealt with in the 60s, but now is in a hyperbolic or a real way, it's gone well beyond that. So this gets us into the politics of the question. Now we've talked about the theology and psychology and science a little bit. Now the politics. Sometimes people say that Christians are preoccupied with homosexual sex. I have a gay cleric friend nearby here working at Purdue University's campus who once said to me, people talk about homosexuality, and there are about 6 passages in the Bible, but I turn them to the 600 passages referring to heterosexual sex. And why is it that Christians are so preoccupied with gay sex? And so, are Christians politically preoccupied with gay sex? Maybe there's a distinction to be made here between homosexuality and homosexualism now.
I think all of us know that Christians are not preoccupied with gay sex. You brought up chocolate earlier, okay? Suppose I'm on a crusade. You have to eat chocolate. You have to eat chocolate. You have to eat chocolate. And you're saying, I don't want to eat chocolate. I don't want to eat chocolate. I don't want to eat chocolate. I say, Corey, why are you so obsessed with chocolate? Well, you're not. You didn't start this. I'm trying to force something on you, and you just keep saying no. That's all that's happening. And then I turn around and say that you're the one who's obsessed. We didn't pick this battle. We never even wanted to talk about this. At the beginning of the show, you brought up pro-gay theology, and I said, who knew? That's really true. It was not something that we ever thought we'd even have to defend. We certainly didn't want to. But what we are seeing is a demand being placed on the church. Now, all those other sins that are heterosexual in nature, when the pro-pornography movement, the pro-prostitution movement, the pro-swinging movement, the pro-polyamory movement starts getting forceful with us the way the gay rights movement is, we'll push back on them too.
Right, and it'll make it look like we're preoccupied.
It's like that pushing us the way the LGBTQ movement is pushing us. So it's very disingenuous, really very dishonest to push you and push you and push you and then say, why are you preoccupied with me pushing you? Well, I guess because you're pushing me, okay?
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. Well, you have written about sexuality and spirituality. How, and you've commented a little bit earlier on this, but how would you advise counseling gay men in particular? I mean, legally in California, for you to do that is, oh my goodness, you could get crucified there. But how do you advise counseling gay men who struggle with homosexual desires, but who believe that same-sex desire isn't desirable? It isn't what we ought to desire.
Thank you for making that distinction, because a lot of people will say, how do you counsel gay men? Which gay men? I mean, there are ones who are repentant. There are ones who are defiant. There are ones who are questioning. If a gay man isn't a Christian, I don't care if he's gay. I want to talk to him about salvation because that is the issue. Like Jesus talking to the woman at the well. Forget about the fact she's had a bunch of men. She's not born again. He wants her to live. Someone who is waving the banner and calling you a hater because of what you believe, you try to reason with them. But the group you just named, that's the group I've had the honor of serving for 35 years now. And Corey, this is one of the most wonderful things. In this day, like 2022, as we're speaking, there are people who are saying no to homosexuality when the whole culture is telling them they should say yes to it. That's the gospel power. People responding to the gospel, and they're swimming upstream no matter what the world is saying. How do you counsel them? The way you would disciple anyone, you'd say, okay, look, you want to invest in your intimacy with God, get deep in the word on the daily basis, develop your Bible study life, develop your prayer life, be in a good Bible believing church, make friends, develop solid relationships, get some mentoring from someone who understands the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. Don't make this your primary identifying characteristic. Though I would counsel such a guy, do not let that voice in your head tell you you are separate from the other men in the church, that you are separate from the other guys in the body of Christ. You are not. So I always tell guys, hey, you are coming from a long line of people who have dealt with this. You can deal with it as anyone else can. Take up your cross, follow him. I'm not going to promise you that all the temptations will go away, and I'm not going to tell you that they won't go away, because God deals with each person individually. Some find that they have relief from homosexual temptations and they get married. Great. Others find that they struggle regularly with those temptations. God gives them the grace to live a celibate, godly life. That's also great. Paul said, don't elevate one over the other. My bias, I really believe most men need to be married. I think that marriage is for most the logical outcome, but we don't push that on people because we don't know. It's like Jesus talking to Peter after the resurrection, and he's telling him, you're going to be led where you may not want to go. Peter looks over at John, says, what about him? And Jesus said, you know what? It's really none of your business. You follow me, he'll follow me. The outcome for you guys will be different, but the call is the same. Follow me. And that's what I say to guys dealing with this. Are you going to get married like I did? Are you going to find changes in your sexuality like I did? I don't know. What I know is you'll be given the grace and the strength to obey. I know you will be given what you need to live a godly life. That promise is for all of us. What the outcome will be, that's going to be individual. But get hooked into the body, seek and find God's will for your life, and follow it with a passion. Enjoy the rest of us while we do the same. That's the Reader's Digest version, but that's what I'd say, Corey.
Yeah, very good. Very good. There's a statement in the Bible that says that a prophet is never accepted or welcome in his own hometown. And so bringing this to a close, bringing it home, how do you advise people when homosexuality hits home, when a member of the family comes out as gay? That seems to convert a lot of people, just to be able to save the family.
Corey, when you love a person and you love the truth, you can really have a dilemma. Because if you love someone who's not walking in truth, what are you going to experience? Fear, anger, deep heartache. You remember John said in 3 John, I have no greater joy than to hear my children walk in truth. For a parent, the opposite is true. I have no greater fear than to hear my children are not walking in truth. It's a killer. When I came out to my parents, I had no idea I was turning their world upside down. I really didn't. And that's what happens. So the temptation is, well, kill one or the other. Either kill my love because it hurts too much to love you. You're outside God's will. I can't take this. We're just not going to have a relationship. That's not Christ-like. Or kill the truth. Well, maybe it's okay if you're gay. Maybe you should embrace it. Let's all just get along. That's not Christ-like. If you really want to know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, what do you think he suffers on a daily basis? He loves people who are not walking in truth. And he doesn't kill the truth, and he doesn't kill the love. There's your challenge, is by the grace of God, sustain the relationship as much as you're able, and in most cases you can. Grieve the loss of what you assume to be true. Be honest with your loved one about how you feel. ascertain whether or not this is a fixed decision or whether or not this is something they're considering. Try to get an effective dialogue going about how they determine what is true, how they came to this conclusion, how you can better understand them. Try that, and then set the boundaries where you need to. I do not feel that I could, in good conscience, go to a same-sex wedding. If I had a loved one who asked me to go, I would have to say, I love you, but I can't do what I don't believe in. I wouldn't ask you to do what you don't believe in. Please don't ask me to. But I want us to have a relationship. Let's have one. And then having done all of that, you basically land in that same place that I was describing earlier. I know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings. I yearn for my loved one to be brought to truth. I pray for it. I hurt over the fact that he's not there, but I take hope because it is still true. People are still coming out of that life. And I'm exhibit A. Anybody who knew Joe Dallas from 78 to 84 had every good reason to give up on me. They did. And if I could have been turned around, I can hold out hope for anybody.
Amen. Amen. All right. Well, I appreciate you joining us today, Joe, on Thoughtful Christianity. For people who want to...
It's such a pleasure, Corey. It's good to finally get to talk to you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. After all, you had an influence on my life 20 years ago, and now here we are.
And again, who knew?
Yeah. Well, for listeners or viewers of our podcast or vodcast, if you want to follow Joe's thinking more and look at some of his books and ministry items, venues, go to joedallas.com. Very simple website name, joedallas.com. If you want to see some of our educational material at ratiochristi.org, just go there and check out our booklets or ebooks. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your ministry, Joe. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Corey. Appreciate talking to you. Hope we can do it again.
Amen.